The air in the penthouse suite of the Grand Astoria Hotel was not merely air, it was a carefully curated atmosphere of power. It smelled of old money, of cedar from the humidor on the mahogany table, of expensive leather from the deep-set armchairs, and a faint, almost imperceptible trace of truffle oil from a forgotten appetizer. Outside the floor-to-ceiling armored glass, the city sprawled below, a glittering tapestry of lights that seemed to bow in deference to the men in this room. The silence was not empty but heavy, thick, with unspoken threats and the silent hum of immense, dangerous capital changing hands. Every surface gleamed under the soft, strategic lighting from recessed fixtures in the ceiling, reflecting the faces of men who did not deal in pleasantries, but in territories, in loyalty, and in fear. The crystal glasses on the silver tray felt impossibly fragile in this environment, like delicate dewdrops on a battlefield. The only sound was the distant, muted siren of a world far below, a world that operated on different rules, a world that these men looked down upon both literally and figuratively. This was a golden sanctuary, a gilded cage where fates were decided, where empires could be forged or shattered with the stroke of a pen on heavy, cream-colored paper. Alara Vance moved through this sanctuary like a ghost, her presence as unobtrusive as the silent, state-of-the-art air conditioning. Her uniform was a simple, impeccably tailored black dress, her hair pulled back into a severe knot, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She was 28, but in this uniform, in this role, she was ageless, nameless, a functional component of the opulent scenery. Her movements were a study in efficiency, honed over 3 years of serving the city's elite. She refilled a water glass without a single drop spilling, her hand steady, her wrist fluid. She replaced a coaster with a silent, practiced motion, her eyes never lingering, never making contact unless directly addressed. To the men in this room, she was part of the furniture, as inanimate as the marble bust in the corner or the abstract painting on the wall. They spoke freely in front of her, their voices rumbling with discussions of logistics and percentages, confident in her invisibility. She was a pair of hands, a silent server, an automobileton programmed for deference and silence. And that was precisely the way she needed it to be, for behind the placid mask of the servant, a different mind was at work, a mind that was constantly observing, analyzing, and remembering everything. The woman pouring chilled water was not Alara Vance, the caterer. She was Alara Vance, the doctoral prodigy who had once been the brightest star in the psychology department of Columbia University. Her entire world had been one of academic rigor, of studying the subtle, involuntary languages of the human body. Her specialization was a field so niche it was almost an art form: micro-expressions and non-verbal deception detection. She had spent thousands of hours in university labs, analyzing slow-motion footage of interrogations, of high-stakes negotiations, of courtroom testimonies. She could spot the fleeting 1/25th of a second flash of contempt in a politician's smile, the subtle flare of a nostril that betrayed fear, the almost imperceptible shift in posture that signaled a lie. Her dissertation, a groundbreaking work on the correlation between vocal pitch and premeditated deceit, was nearly complete when the phone call came. It was about her father, a man who had built a small, successful manufacturing business from nothing. A hostile takeover, they'd said. Predatory, but legal. His life's work had been devoured by a faceless corporate entity, and the shock, the sheer weight of the loss, had triggered a massive stroke. The man who had taught her to ride a bike, who had beamed with pride at her academic achievements, was now a ghost in his own body, trapped in a hospital bed, his bright eyes dulled by a permanent fog of confusion and pain. Her academic career, her promising future, had evaporated in the sterile, antiseptic smell of that hospital hallway. The world of theories and dissertations was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her father's medical bills were a relentless, crushing avalanche of numbers, each invoice a fresh wave of panic, So she had traded her lab coat for a server's uniform, her academic journals for silver trays. But the skill, the one she had honed to a razor's edge, had not vanished. It had simply been repurposed, a sophisticated weapon used for a menial war of survival. She used it to navigate her precarious daily life. She could read the subtle tension in her manager's jaw to know when her job was on the line. She could anticipate a wealthy client's unspoken demand by the slight furrow of their brow. It was a constant humming feed of information that flowed into her mind, a silent broadcast of the hidden truths behind people's masks. In this penthouse, surrounded by men who wore masks of pure power, her senses were on high alert. It was an academic exercise in the most dangerous laboratory she had ever encountered, a place where a single miscalculation could have consequences far more severe than a failed experiment. The atmosphere in the room, already thick with tension, solidified when Riccardo Moretti walked in. He didn't just enter, he conquered the space. The other men, titans in their own right, subtly shifted in their seats, their postures becoming more deferential. Moretti was of a new breed, a man who cloaked his brutality in the language of private equity and corporate synergy. He wore a Brioni suit that probably cost more than Alara's entire annual income, the fabric shimmering under the soft lights. A Patek Philippe watch peeked from his cuff, not as a timepiece, but as a declaration of his own value. But it was his eyes that held the true measure of the man. They were cold, like polished river stones, and they swept across the room with a gaze that didn't see people, but assessed assets and liabilities. He acknowledged the other Don, Antonio Gallo, with a nod that was less a greeting and more a confirmation of his own superior status. When his eyes passed over Illyra, there was not a flicker of recognition that she was a human being. It was the same look one might give a lamp, a chair, an object occupying space that was rightfully his. He was the viper in the title of his own legend, coiled and confident, radiating a chillingly smooth arrogance that promised a swift, merciless strike. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below and be sure to subscribe to join our community. The negotiations began in earnest. Don Antonio Gallo, the man opposite Moretti, was a relic of an older world. His face was a roadmap of a long, hard life, his hands thick and calloused, his presence grounded and weary. He represented the old ways, a code of honor, however brutal, that Moretti viewed with open contempt. Moretti, on the other hand, was all fluid motion and predatory charm. He spoke of the peace treaty not as a truce between rivals, but as a merger, a strategic alliance that would benefit everyone. He used terms like leveraging assets and market consolidation, corporate jargon that sounded alien and obscene in this context of blood and power. Allara moved silently around the periphery, refilling Gallo's water, ensuring the tray of untouched pastries was perfectly aligned. She listened to Moretti's smooth, confident voice, but she watched his face. She saw the minute tightening around his mouth when he mentioned shared territories. She noted the way his blink rate increased slightly when he spoke of mutual trust. These were the tells, the tiny cracks in the polished facade, the language his body was speaking while his mouth wove a tapestry of lies. The inciting incident, when it came, was not a shout or a threat, but a quiet, casual act of profound dehumanization. Moretti was in the final stages of his pitch, his voice a purr of false sincerity as he detailed the final terms of the deal, terms Alara's instincts screamed were a trap. To demonstrate his complete and utter dominance, to show Gallo that he was so relaxed he could afford to be flippant, he gestured vaguely toward Allara with a dismissive wave of his hand. He didn't look at her. He kept his cold eyes fixed on Gallo. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He spoke about the importance of discretion, of how one could say anything in a room like this, because the help, the invisible people who served them, were as deaf and dumb as the expensive furniture. The insult was not for her. She was merely the prop he used to deliver it. It was a power play, a way of telling Gallo, I own this space, I own the people in it, and soon, I will own you too." The words hung in the air, another layer of poison in the already toxic atmosphere. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down for Ilara. The dismissive wave of Moretti's hand, the casual cruelty in his voice, the utter contempt in his throwaway line, it all coalesced into a single, sharp point of pain. It wasn't the insult itself that struck her, but the chilling familiarity of the sentiment behind it. This was the voice of the faceless, arrogant power that had crushed her father. This was the sound of a man who believed wealth and influence made him a god, entitled to break smaller, insignificant people for his own gain. An image, vivid and agonizing, flooded her mind. Her father in his hospital bed, his eyes vacant, a thin line of drool on his chin, his once strong hands trembling and useless. The man who had built a life with those hands, now unable to even hold a spoon. The fury that rose in her was not hot and explosive, but cold and solid, a block of ice forming in her chest. It was a righteous, clarifying anger that burned away all fear, all deference. Her breath became slow and controlled. Her hands, which had been serving drinks moments before, felt steady and strong, as if they were now capable of holding not a silver tray but the weight of justice itself. In that instant, a decision was made. She would no longer be invisible. The moment was a precipice, a silent, razor-thin edge between two futures. Ilara Vance felt the shift in her own body, a transition from passive observer to active agent. The decision to act was not a conscious thought, but a physical imperative, a gravitational pull toward justice that was stronger than any instinct for self-preservation. She moved with the same fluid grace she always did, her steps soundless on the plush Aubusson carpet. To any casual observer, she was simply performing her duty, approaching Don Antonio Gallo to replenish his glass of sparkling water. But inside her, a universe of change was occurring. Her heartbeat was not frantic, but slow and powerful, each beat a hammer blow forging a new resolve. The air she drew into her lungs felt different, charged with purpose. The world had narrowed to the space between her and the old Don, a small, sacred ground where a single truth could be planted like a seed of dynamite. She leaned forward, the silver pitcher in her hand a perfect counterweight, her body a study in professional deference, a posture that was now the ultimate camouflage for an act of insurrection. Her lips parted, and the words she had chosen were released not as a plea, but as a statement of irrefutable fact, a piece of classified intelligence delivered on a battlefield. Her whisper was so low it was more a vibration in the air than a sound, meant only for Gallo's ear, a secret transmission designed to bypass the enemy's defenses. "Don't sign." His left eye twitches every time he lies. The sentence was a key, forged in the fires of academia and personal tragedy, designed to unlock the cage of deception Moretti had so carefully constructed. As the final syllable left her lips, she was already pulling back, the motion seamless, her task complete. She placed the pitcher back on her silver tray, her expression returning to the placid, unreadable mask of a servant. She had lit the fuse. Now, she simply had to step back into the shadows and wait for the detonation, a silent, invisible figure who had just altered the course of empires with 7 simple words. The risk was monumental, a gamble that could cost her not just her job, but her very life. Yet in that moment, the image of her father's vacant eyes was the only collateral that mattered. Don Antonio Gallo froze. It was not a dramatic, theatrical pause, but a complete cessation of movement, as if a master switch had been thrown somewhere deep inside his nervous system. The gold-plated pen in his hand, a heavy, ostentatious instrument gifted by Moretti himself, stopped its descent, hovering a mere inch above the heavy cream paper of the treaty. The silence in the room, already thick with tension, suddenly became absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the air and sound out of the penthouse. Gallo's eyes, which had been fixed on the signature line, a symbol of his reluctant surrender, slowly lifted. They did not look at Ilara. they did not look at his own men. They moved with a chilling, deliberate slowness to the face of Riccardo Moretti. The whisper was still echoing in his mind, not as a sound, but as an idea, a lens that had been placed over his perception, bringing into sharp, terrifying focus a detail he had noticed but had not understood. The twitch. He had seen it. He had dismissed it as a nervous tic, a minor imperfection in the man's otherwise flawless composure. Now the memory of it returned, imbued with a sinister new meaning. The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted from one of strained diplomacy to that of a live bomb. Moretti, basking in the glow of his imminent victory, was the first to sense the change. He had been leaning back in his chair, a picture of relaxed dominance, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips. But when Gallo's pen did not touch the paper, when the old Don's gaze settled on him with a new, unnerving intensity, Moretti's smile faltered. His body tensed, the relaxed posture vanishing, replaced by the coiled readiness of a predator that senses a trap. He followed Gallo's line of sight, but it led only to him. He scanned the room, his eyes darting between Gallo's stony face and the other men, who were now sitting straighter, their hands moving away from their drinks and closer to their jackets. The power dynamic, which he had so carefully orchestrated, was suddenly, inexplicably, collapsing around him. He could feel the control slipping through his fingers like fine sand, and the confusion on his face was rapidly being replaced by a dark, gathering storm of rage. Gallo's mind, a repository of decades of betrayals and alliances, was working with cold, brutal efficiency. He replayed the entire negotiation in his head, but now he was watching for the twitch, the promises of shared shipping lanes through the port of Newark. The twitch had been there, a flicker as quick as a hummingbird's wing, the assurance that Gallo's existing businesses would remain untouched. The twitch again, more pronounced that time. The solemn vow of mutual respect and a new era of peace, a rapid, almost convulsive flutter of the eyelid. The whispered words of the serving girl were not an accusation. They were a diagnosis. She had given him the Rosetta Stone to decipher Moretti's lies. The treaty before him was no longer a document of peace. It was his own death warrant, a beautifully calligraphed instrument of his complete and utter annihilation. He felt a chill creep up his spine, the cold dread of a man who had come within a single penstroke of walking into his own open grave. With a slowness that was both terrifying and magnificent, Don Gallo placed the gold pen on the mahogany table. It made a soft, definitive click, a sound that echoed in the dead silence like a gunshot. The deal was dead. Every man in the room understood it. Moretti's carefully constructed illusion of control shattered into a million pieces. The smooth, corporate charm evaporated from his face, replaced by a mask of raw, unfiltered fury. His voice, when he finally spoke, was no longer the purring, persuasive tone of a CEO, but the guttural snarl of a cornered animal. He didn't yell, not at first. The question was low, dangerous, and aimed like a weapon at Gallo. "What did she say to you?" The words were clipped, each one a shard of ice. He did not yet look at Ilara, as if acknowledging her existence would be to give her a power he could not comprehend. His entire world was predicated on people like her being invisible, and that foundation was now cracking beneath his feet. Ilara stood perfectly still by the serving cart, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze directed at a point on the far wall. She was the calm at the center of the hurricane she had created. Outwardly, she was a statue of professional servitude. Inwardly, her mind was a supercomputer, recording every detail of Moretti's collapse. She saw the blood rush to his face, the crimson tide climbing his neck. She saw the distinct flare of his nostrils, a classic sign of imminent aggression. She noted the way the muscles in his jaw bunched into tight, hard knots. He was losing control, and in his world, a loss of control was a fatal weakness. He was reacting exactly as her studies predicted an extreme narcissist would when their superiority was fundamentally challenged. He couldn't process that his intricate deception had been unraveled by someone he considered less than human, and the cognitive dissonance was driving him into a blind rage. Finally, Moretti's burning gaze fell upon Ilara, and the full force of his venom was unleashed. He rose from his chair, not fully standing, but leaning over the table, his knuckles white where they pressed into the polished wood. "Maid!" His voice was a roar now, the thin veneer of civility completely gone. "What did you say to him?" He pointed a trembling finger at her, his face contorted in a mask of disbelief and contempt. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the hotel's security chief, who stood nervously by the door. "Get her out of here. Now. I want her fired. I want her blacklisted from every hotel, every restaurant, every gutter in this city." He was trying to reassert his dominance the only way he knew how, by threatening to obliterate someone powerless. He was trying to erase her, to make her invisible again, to prove to everyone in the room that she was nothing, a momentary glitch in his otherwise perfect machine. But Don Gallo was no longer listening to Moretti. The Viper's tantrum was nothing more than the confirmation he needed. A man with nothing to hide does not react with such explosive, uncontrolled fury. Gallo raised a hand, a simple, almost lazy gesture that nonetheless carried the weight of absolute authority. The gesture was not directed at Ilara, but at Moretti. "Enough, Ricardo." The old Don's voice was quiet, yet it cut through Moretti's rage like a surgeon's scalpel. "There will be no signing today. The deal, as you have presented it, is off the table." He then turned his gaze to Ilara, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He didn't see a servant or a maid. He saw a mystery, a potential asset, a woman who had, in a single moment, saved his life and his legacy. The curiosity in his eyes was far more dangerous to Moretti than any threat of violence. The power struggle in the room was now palpable, a physical force. Moretti, sputtering with indignation, insisted she be removed. "This is a private meeting. She is a nobody. This is a breach of protocol." He was grasping at the straws of rules and order, the very things he had been planning to violate with his treacherous treaty. But his authority in this space had vanished. Gallo simply ignored him, turning to his own two bodyguards who stood like granite statues near the wall. He nodded slightly toward Ilara. "Escort the young lady to my private suite downstairs, see that she is comfortable, and make sure no one disturbs her." The command was clear. She was not being dismissed. She was being protected. She was now under Don Gallo's care, a piece on the chessboard that he now controlled exclusively. Gallo's men moved with silent, professional efficiency. They were large, imposing figures, but they approached Ilara not with intimidation, but with a surprising degree of respect. One opened the door for her while the other stood as a clear barrier between her and Moretti's incandescent rage. As she walked past the mahogany table, she did not look at Moretti. She kept her head held high, her back straight, her steps measured and confident. She could feel his hatred on her, a physical heat, but it no longer had any power over her. She had stepped out of the shadows and into the light, and there was no going back. The journey from the penthouse to the elevator was the longest walk of her life, each step taking her further away from her old existence as a ghost and closer to a future she could not yet imagine. The heavy doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing her in a cocoon of silence, the muffled sound of Moretti's continued shouting a faint, pathetic echo from a world she had just left behind. Back in the penthouse, Riccardo Moretti was left standing in the ruins of his own triumph. He had been publicly thwarted, his authority challenged, and his deception exposed, all by a person whose name he didn't even know. His face was a mottled canvas of red and white, his breath coming in ragged, angry gasps. He looked at Gallo, who was now calmly gathering his papers, his expression one of cold, dismissive finality. The other men in the room, Moretti's supposed allies and Gallo's rivals, avoided his gaze. They were sharks smelling blood in the water, and the blood was his. They had witnessed a catastrophic loss of control, a public display of weakness that would be whispered about in every dark corner of the city by morning. Moretti had tried to project an image of untouchable, modern power, but in the end he had been brought low by a whisper, and his reaction was not that of a king, but of a spoiled, enraged child. Don Gallo paused at the door, turning to deliver one final, devastating blow. "We will speak again, Ricardo, when I have had time to reconsider some of the finer details of your proposal." His voice was laced with a chilling irony. "And when I have had a chance to consult with my new advisor." He didn't need to say who he meant. The implication was a dagger twisted in Moretti's pride. The old Don left, his men following in his wake, leaving Moretti alone in his gilded cage, surrounded by the silent, judging eyes of men who were already calculating how to profit from his fall from grace. The air, once thick with the smell of power and money, now stank of his humiliation. He swept his arm across the table, sending crystal glasses, silver platters, and the cursed treaty crashing to the floor in a symphony of destruction that did nothing to quell the inferno of his rage. Ilara was led into a different kind of suite. It was just as luxurious as the penthouse, but it felt more like a fortress, a command center. The colors were darker, the furniture more functional, the air less perfumed and more serious. One of Gallo's men gestured for her to sit on a plush leather sofa, while the other stood guard by the door. She was left alone, the silence of the room, a stark contrast to the chaos she had just unleashed. For the first time, since she leaned in to whisper in Gallo's ear, a wave of cold reality washed over her. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a tremor of fear. What had she done? She had just deliberately inserted herself into the machinations of one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country. Her carefully constructed life of invisibility was over. She thought of her father, of the medical bills piling up on their small kitchen table, of the precarious stability she had fought so hard to maintain. Had she just jeopardized everything for a single moment of righteous defiance? The fear was a cold, coiling thing in her stomach, but then another image rose to meet it. It was the memory of Moretti's face, the casual contempt in his eyes as he dismissed her, the chilling echo of the same arrogance that had destroyed her family. The fear receded, burned away by the rekindled flame of her cold, hard anger. She had not acted out of recklessness. She had acted out of a duty to the man lying in that hospital bed, a duty to the memory of the strong, vibrant father he once was. She had spent 3 years suffocating her intellect, hiding her talents, bowing and scraping to men who were not fit to polish her father's shoes. No more. Whatever happened next, whatever the consequences, she knew with an unshakable certainty that she had made the right choice. She had finally stopped being a victim of her circumstances and had started to fight back with the only weapon she had ever truly owned: her mind. The door opened, and Don Gallo entered, alone. He had shed the tension of the negotiation, and his face was now a mask of calm, intense curiosity. He did not sit opposite her, in a position of interrogation, but chose an armchair nearby, creating an atmosphere of conversation rather than confrontation. He studied her for a long moment, his old, wise eyes taking in her simple uniform, her severe hairstyle, her hands resting calmly in her lap. He was trying to reconcile the image of the humble servant with the woman who had possessed the knowledge and the courage to detonate a multi-million-dollar peace treaty with a single whisper. His first question was simple, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Who are you?" It was not a demand for her name, but for an explanation of her existence, of how she came to be in that room with that specific, world-altering piece of information. Ilara met his gaze without fear. The time for hiding was over. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs and steadying her nerves. "My name is Ilara Vance." For the next 10 minutes, she spoke, her voice calm and clinical, the voice of a scholar delivering a lecture. She explained her doctoral research at Columbia. She spoke of her specialization in micro-expressions, in nonverbal communication, in the science of deception detection. She did not frame it as a magical gift, but as a field of rigorous academic study, a skill honed over thousands of hours of analyzing video footage, of reading peer-reviewed papers, of conducting controlled experiments. She was not just telling him what she could do, she was establishing her credibility, proving that her observation was not a lucky guess, but the result of a lifetime of dedicated intellectual work. She used Moretti as a case study, her tone becoming more focused, more precise. When he spoke of guaranteeing your territories in the South, his blink rate increased by 30%, a common indicator of cognitive load associated with fabricating a complex lie. When he promised to respect your family, he displayed a fleeting, one-sided mouth shrug, a classic micro-expression of contempt, indicating he felt the exact opposite of the words he was speaking. And the eye twitch, she concluded, was his most significant tell, an involuntary muscular contraction linked to the stress of maintaining a high-stakes deception. It wasn't just a twitch, it was a confession, a physiological betrayal from a body that could not lie as skillfully as its owner's mouth. Gallo listened with rapt attention, his expression unreadable, but Ilara could see the subtle signs that he was absorbing every word. He leaned forward slightly, his posture one of deep engagement. His own blink rate had slowed, a sign of intense concentration. He was a man who had survived for decades by relying on his gut, on an instinct for betrayal honed in the brutal streets. What Ilara was describing was a scientific, systematic version of his own survival instinct. She was giving a name and a structure to the shadows he had always felt but could never fully grasp. She was translating the arcane language of the human body into plain, actionable intelligence, and he was beginning to understand the immense power of the weapon she wielded. As she finished her explanation, a silence fell over the room once more. On a large television screen mounted to the wall, a financial news network was playing on mute. It was a background detail, a flickering light in the corner of her vision, displaying stock tickers and talking heads. One of Gallo's men, sensing the conversation had reached a natural pause, quietly turned up the volume. A news anchor's polished voice filled the room, introducing a special segment. Tonight, we take a look back at the meteoric rise of one of Wall Street's most formidable players, the self-made billionaire Riccardo Moretti, a man they called the Viper for his ruthless efficiency in the world of private equity. Ilara's blood ran cold. The screen was filled with a glossy corporate photo of Moretti, smiling confidently, the picture of a legitimate captain of industry. The report began to detail his history, starting with his first major private equity firm, a company he founded a decade ago called Apex Consolidated. The name hit Ilara with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She stared at the screen, at the crisp, stylized logo of a mountain peak, with the words Apex Consolidated beneath it. It was a logo that had been burned into her memory, a symbol of ruin that had haunted her nightmares for 3 long years. The news segment continued, showing a montage of the small, family-owned businesses that Apex had acquired in its early days, lauding Moretti's genius for identifying and absorbing undervalued assets. The anchor spoke of growth, of synergy, of market consolidation, using the same sterile, bloodless language that the lawyers had used when they had informed her father that his life's work was no longer his. Then it appeared. For no more than 3 seconds, the screen showed a grainy photograph of a modest brick building. The sign above the door, clearly visible, Vance Manufacturing. Her father's company. Her family's name. The camera in the news report panned over a line of laid-off workers, their faces grim, and then cut to a shot of a smiling Riccardo Moretti ringing the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange. In that sickening, gut-wrenching moment of television journalism, Ilara's entire world collapsed, and then reformed into a new, terrifying shape. This was not a random encounter. This was not a simple act of defiance against an arrogant client. The man in the penthouse upstairs, the man whose grand deception she had just exposed, was not just any powerful man. He was the man. the architect of her family's destruction, the direct cause of her father's stroke, the source of every sleepless night, every mounting bill, every ounce of pain and humiliation she had endured for the past 3 years. A wave of nausea and white-hot rage washed over her, so powerful it threatened to pull her under. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, the news anchor's voice fading into a meaningless drone. All she could see was that logo, that name, that smiling, predatory face. The cold, professional fury she had felt earlier was a child's tantrum compared to the abyssal, soul-deep hatred that now filled her. This was no longer about justice in the abstract. This was a reckoning. The universe, in its cruel and mysterious way, had not just placed her in the same room as her family's destroyer, it had given her the opportunity to become the instrument of his. Her mission, which had been born only an hour ago, had transformed. It was no longer about a simple warning. It was now about a war, a total and uncompromising war for the memory of her father and the life that had been stolen from them. She did not scream. She did not cry. All the roiling, chaotic emotion inside her solidified into a single point of diamond-hard clarity. She became unnaturally still, her hands clenching into fists in her lap, her knuckles turning white. Her face, which had been pale, now seemed carved from ice, and her eyes, when she finally tore them away from the television screen, burned with an intensity that made Don Gallo, a man who had faced down murderers and psychopaths, lean back slightly in his chair. He had seen that look before, but only in the eyes of people pushed far beyond the brink, people with nothing left to lose and a singular, all-consuming purpose. He saw the change in her, the shift from a frightened academic to something far more dangerous. "What is it?" Gallo asked, his voice low, sensing he was on the verge of a revelation far more significant than a twitching eye. Ilara turned her head slowly, her gaze locking with his. The server was gone. The doctoral candidate was gone. All that was left was the raw, focused will of a daughter, whose life had been dedicated to a singular, burning purpose she had only just discovered. Apex consolidated, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence. They destroyed my father's company. That man, Riccardo Moretti, he is the reason my father is in a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to remember his own name. He took everything from us. Her words hung in the air, a declaration of war. Don Gallo looked from her face, blazing with a righteous fire, to the smiling image of Moretti on the screen. In that moment, he understood everything. He was not looking at a caterer or an academic. He was looking at a weapon, a precision instrument of vengeance that had been delivered directly into his hands. He realized that Moretti's greatest mistake was not the twitch in his eye or the treachery in his heart. It was the fatal, arrogant error of believing that the people he crushed under his feet would simply stay that way. He had created his own destroyer, and he didn't even have the slightest idea that she was now in the next room, forging an alliance that would bring his entire corrupt empire crashing down around him. The board was set, the pieces were in motion, and Ilara Vance was no longer a pawn. She was the queen. The alliance between Ilara Vance and Don Antonio Gallo was forged not in a handshake or a sworn oath, but in a long, profound silence that filled the luxurious suite. The morning sun cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the ghost of a man who now sat before her, a titan of an old world who had just been shown the terrifying landscape of the new one. Gallo did not speak of loyalty or revenge. He spoke of resources. He described a network that spread like unseen roots beneath the city, a web of contacts, of safe houses, of men whose loyalty was absolute and whose skills were varied and specific. He laid out his empire not as a criminal enterprise, but as a toolkit, an arsenal of assets he was now placing at her complete disposal. For him, this was no longer just about surviving a treacherous rival. It was about principle. Moretti had violated a code far older than any corporate charter, and in doing so, had revealed a weakness that Gallo, with his old world wisdom, knew was fatal. A complete and utter lack of respect for the forces one cannot see. He saw in Alara the ultimate unseen force, an intellectual ghost capable of haunting Moretti's digital and financial houses. He gave her a simple, solemn promise. You tell me what you need, and you will have it. No questions asked. Alara listened, her mind already processing, strategizing, moving far beyond the immediate shock of her discovery. The burning, personal hatred for Moretti was a fuel, but she would not let it become a fire that consumed her. Instead, she channeled it into a cold, precise engine of logic. She explained to Gallo that a direct, physical assault was exactly what Moretti would expect, and therefore what they must avoid. His strength was in brutality and intimidation, in the world of overt power. His weakness, she theorized, was in the details he considered beneath him, the vast, complex machinery of his supposedly legitimate businesses. That was their battlefield. She did not need soldiers or weapons in the traditional sense. She needed something far more potent. Information. She needed access to Apex Consolidated servers, their accounting records, their offshore holding companies. She needed to map the flow of his money, the lifeblood of his empire. She explained that a man like Moretti, a narcissist of the highest order, would have built his financial kingdom as a monument to himself, full of clever tricks and hidden passages, but ultimately flawed by his own arrogance. Believing no one would ever be smart enough to navigate its labyrinthine corridors, she would be the one to prove him wrong. Their first target was not a person, but a vulnerability. Alara spent 2 days in a secure, windowless room that Gallo had provided, a space that was once a bookkeeper's office and now served as her war room. The walls were lined with whiteboards, and the air smelled of dry erase markers and stale coffee. She did not sleep. She consumed every piece of public information available on Riccardo Moretti and Apex Consolidated. Years of annual reports, shareholder letters, press releases, and every fawning interview he had ever given. She wasn't looking for financial data. She was looking for the man. She analyzed his word choices, the cadence of his speech, the metaphors he favored. She was creating a psychological profile, a map of his ego. She noted his obsessive use of mountaineering terms, conquering markets, scaling heights, reaching the summit. It was a tell, a glimpse into his self-perception as an indomitable climber. She knew that to find a way into his fortress, she needed to find the man who held the keys, someone who was close to the summit but secretly resented the climber. Her research, cross-referenced with Gallo's deep knowledge of the city's professional circles, pointed to one name, Silvio Romano. Silvio Romano was Moretti's chief financial officer, a man in his late 60s who had been with Apex since its inception. He was a relic of an older school of accounting, a man of ledgers and balanced books who now found himself adrift in a sea of algorithmic trading and shadowy shell corporations. Gallo's intel painted a picture of a man who was deeply respected, but quietly marginalized within his own company. Moretti treated him like a piece of antique furniture, a necessary but outdated fixture. Alara saw something more. In photographs from company events, she analyzed Silvio's posture when standing near Moretti. She saw the subtle, almost imperceptible signs of resentment. The slight tightening of the lips, the way his shoulders angled away from his boss, the forced, hollow smile that never reached his tired eyes. She told Gallo that Silvio was their way in. He wasn't a man motivated by greed. He was a man whose pride had been slowly, systematically eroded for a decade. He wouldn't be bribed with money. He would be swayed by an appeal to his legacy, a chance to restore the order and integrity he felt Moretti had desecrated. The meeting was arranged with the delicate precision of a state secret. It took place not in a dark alley, but in the rare books section of the New York Public Library, a sanctuary of quiet dignity that Alara chose specifically to appeal to Silvio's old-world sensibilities. She was not dressed as a server, but in a simple professional blazer and slacks, looking every bit the graduate student she once was. Gallo was not present. His involvement had to remain a deep, hidden secret. Ilara approached Silvio as he perused a collection of Renaissance literature. She didn't open with threats or offers. She opened with a question about his first accounting job at a small, family-owned textile firm in the garment district, a detail she had unearthed from a local newspaper archive. The question disarmed him completely. For the next 20 minutes, she didn't mention Moretti. She spoke of her father's business, of the pride in building something honest, of the soul-crushing nature of watching it be devoured by a faceless entity that valued numbers over people. She was speaking his language, mirroring his own unspoken grief for a profession he no longer recognized. Silvio listened, his guard slowly lowering, his face a mask of weary sorrow. Ilara then made her move, her voice dropping to a near whisper amidst the hallowed silence of the library. She explained that she knew about the secondary set of books, the shadow ledger that detailed the real transactions of Apex Consolidated, the ones that bypassed regulators and shareholders. She didn't frame it as an accusation, but as a burden. She spoke of the weight of his complicity, the slow poisoning of a man's soul when he is forced to facilitate the very corruption he despises. She could see the truth of her words in the subtle tremor in his hand, the way his gaze dropped to the floor, the flicker of shame in his eyes. She wasn't offering him a deal. She was offering him absolution. A chance, she said, to balance the books one final time, not for Moretti, but for himself. She gave him a small, encrypted thumb drive, no bigger than his thumbnail, and a single, untraceable burner phone. Then she walked away, leaving him alone with his conscience and the heaviest decision of his life. For 3 agonizing days, there was nothing. Ilara remained cloistered in her war room, the silence stretching her nerves to their breaking point. She wrestled with the fear that she had miscalculated, that Silvio's fear of Moretti would outweigh his desire for redemption. During those long, silent hours, the image of her father was her constant companion. She remembered his workshop, the smell of grease and metal, the sound of his cheerful whistling as he worked on a piece of machinery. He was a builder, a creator, a man who believed in the tangible value of a day's hard work. Moretti was a destroyer, a parasite who created nothing, only consumed. The injustice of it was a physical ache in her chest, a fire that burned away her fear and left only a cold, hard resolve. She would not fail. She would tear down Moretti's paper empire, even if she had to do it one number at a time, for the man who could no longer whistle, for the man who had forgotten the smell of his own workshop. The weight was a test of her faith in her own methods, her own understanding of human nature. On the 4th day, the burner phone vibrated. There was no call, only a single, anonymous text message. It contained a string of alphanumeric characters, a complex password, and a simple 3-word message, "For my soul." Ilara felt a surge of triumph so powerful it left her breathless. She had been right. She had read him perfectly. The password was the key to a virtual private network, a backdoor into Apex Consolidated's deepest, darkest secrets. She plugged the thumb drive Silvio had given her into a powerful, isolated laptop provided by Gallo. The drive contained a single, heavily encrypted file. Using the password from the text message, she unlocked it. Her screen was instantly flooded with files, spreadsheets, and internal memos, the shadow ledger she had gambled on. It was Silvio's life's work, a meticulous, secret record of every crime, every act of fraud, every dollar laundered through Moretti's vast and intricate network of shell corporations. It was a confession, a roadmap, and a weapon, all in one. The hunt had officially begun. The next 2 weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled obsession. Ilara descended into the digital labyrinth of Moretti's finances, and in that darkness, she was reborn. This was not the sterile theoretical work of her university lab. This was a live excavation of a dragon's hoard, and every piece of gold was stained with the blood of families like hers. The numbers on the screen were not abstract figures. They were the stolen pensions of factory workers, the liquidated assets of bankrupt small businesses, the life savings of people who had been systematically crushed. She worked with a furious, methodical intensity, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She used sophisticated data mining software to cross-reference transactions, to trace the flow of money through a dizzying array of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Panama, and Cyprus. She was no longer just a psychologist. She had become a forensic accountant, a digital detective following a trail of breadcrumbs that Moretti, in his supreme arrogance, believed was too complex for anyone to follow. She began to see the patterns, the ghost in the machine that was Riccardo Moretti himself. She noticed that his largest fraudulent transactions were always initiated on the anniversaries of his major corporate conquests, a clear sign of his narcissistic need to commemorate his own ruthlessness. She discovered a slush fund hidden within a subsidiary that was named after the street he grew up on in Queens. A sentimental, amateurish mistake that betrayed his desperate need to prove how far he had come. And then she found it, buried deep within a folder labeled Legacy Acquisitions. She found the files on Vance Manufacturing. She opened them, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the predatory loan agreements, the manufactured defaults, the undervalued asset seizure, all laid out in cold, clinical detail. She saw the final signature on the acquisition document, Riccardo Moretti. Seeing his name on that line, the very signature that had signed her father's life away, did not break her. It forged her into something harder, something unbreakable. The evidence of financial fraud was overwhelming, enough to interest the SEC and the IRS for a decade. But Ilara knew it wasn't enough to truly destroy him in the world he inhabited. The federal government was a slow, ponderous beast. Moretti could tie up any case in litigation for years, bleeding it dry with appeals and procedural delays. To defeat him, she needed to strike at the heart of his power, his reputation within the criminal underworld. She needed proof of his treachery against his own kind, something that would turn his allies into his executioners. The Shadow Ledger detailed many of his illicit activities, but the plan to assassinate Don Gallo was not the kind of thing one committed to a spreadsheet. It would be hidden elsewhere, in his private communications, a place protected by layers of military-grade encryption that Silvio's password could not bypass. For the first time in her investigation, she had hit a solid brick wall. The frustration was immense. She was so close, yet the final, crucial piece of the puzzle remained just out of reach. She spent days trying to find a weakness in the encryption, running algorithms that all failed, one after another. She felt the pressure mounting, the fear that Moretti would sense something was wrong and move his data, erasing the trail forever. It was in a moment of utter exhaustion, staring at a photo of Moretti from a magazine interview, that the breakthrough came. In the interview, he had bragged about his commitment to his Italian heritage, making a clumsy, pedantic reference to Dante's Inferno. He had quoted a line in Italian, a line about the ninth circle of hell reserved for traitors. It was a small, arrogant boast, a piece of intellectual preening. But Ilara's mind, trained to see connections where others saw chaos, lit up. His password philosophy wasn't based on sentiment, like the name of his childhood street. It was based on his ego, on his self-image as a ruthless, intellectual predator. She returned to the encrypted files, her fingers trembling with a new, electric certainty. She began inputting variations of the Dante quote, trying different combinations of the Italian words, numbers, and symbols. Cocytus 9. Traitoris nono. She tried dozens of combinations, each one met with the cold, digital finality of access denied, but she did not stop. She thought about his psychology, his need to feel superior, to be the smartest man in the room. The password wouldn't be simple. It would be a reflection of his own perceived brilliance. She tried one last combination, a complex string that combined the first letter of each word in the quote, the number of the canto it came from, and the year the book was published. She typed it in, held her breath, and pressed enter. The screen flickered, and then a new word appeared in green, glowing letters, access. Granted, she was in. Inside was a treasure trove of Moretti's most secret communications. Encrypted emails, text messages, and voice notes. It was a chronicle of his betrayals. And there, in a series of messages to a trusted, off-the-books wetwork team, was the entire plan. It was codenamed Project Checkmate. The messages laid out the plot to assassinate Don Gallo and his top lieutenants in the chaotic aftermath of the treaty signing. The treaty itself was designed to lull Gallo into a false sense of security, to bring all his key people together in one place, making them an easy target. The messages were dated, time-stamped, and utterly irrefutable. It was the smoking gun. It was more than just proof of a planned murder. It was proof of a profound violation of the underworld's most sacred codes. It was an act of treachery so profound it would make him a pariah, a man with a death sentence on his head in every corner of the city. As Alara downloaded the files, a new sense of danger began to creep in. An operation of this magnitude, digging this deep into a man's empire, could not go completely unnoticed. An automated security alert would have been triggered somewhere in Moretti's system. A silent alarm would be ringing in some server farm in Delaware. She knew their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Moretti might not know who was coming for him or how, but he would know that his fortress had been breached. His paranoia would be ignited, and he would begin to cover his tracks, to shred the evidence, both digital and human. He would start moving money, erasing files, and silencing anyone who knew too much. The race was on. They were no longer just hunting him, he was now, unknowingly, hunting them back. The evidence was now complete. Alara sat in the war room, the glow of the monitor illuminating her face. Before her were two distinct piles of digital ammunition. The first was a mountain of financial data, meticulously organized, detailing a decade of fraud, extortion, and theft, proof that would dismantle his legitimate corporate empire and send him to prison for the rest of his natural life. The second was a single slender file containing the Project Checkmate communications, the dagger that would end his reign in the underworld instantly and permanently. She had everything she needed. The quiet, invisible server had gathered enough evidence to destroy a king. Now, all that was left was to plan the execution. She picked up the burner phone and made the call to Don Gallo, her voice calm, steady, and cold as ice. "I have it all," she said. "It's time to arrange the meeting." The final confrontation was no longer a distant hope. It was an imminent reality, a carefully laid trap for a viper who had no idea he was about to slither into his own reckoning. Don Gallo arrived within the hour, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Alara laid out the plan on the large mahogany table in his private study, a room that smelled of old books and cigar smoke. Her demeanor was no longer that of a nervous academic or a grieving daughter. She was a field marshal, briefing her general before the final decisive battle. She explained that they could not simply leak the information. To do so would be to give Moretti a chance to spin the narrative, to use his army of lawyers and public relations experts to muddy the waters. The exposure had to be public, personal, and absolute. It had to happen in his arena, in front of his peers, where his humiliation would be the main event. She proposed using Moretti's own arrogance against him one last time. They would leak a small, anonymous tip to one of Moretti's rivals, suggesting that Gallo was planning to betray him. Moretti, ever the narcissist, would seize the opportunity to call an emergency meeting of the Commission, the ruling council of the city's crime families, to publicly accuse and humiliate Gallo. He would walk into the room expecting to be the judge, jury, and executioner, never suspecting that he was, in fact, the one on trial. What was the most satisfying moment of Riccardo Moretti's downfall for you? Let us know in the comments. The private dining room at Valeriano's, a bastion of old-world power nestled in the heart of Little Italy, was a place where history was written in blood and signed in smoke. The air was a thick concoction of aged leather, expensive burgundy, and the sweet, cloying scent of cigar smoke from the ashtrays that dotted the long, dark wood table. The walls were adorned with oil paintings of stern-faced men from a bygone era, their eyes seeming to judge the proceedings of the present. This was Riccardo Moretti's chosen stage, a room that reeked of the very tradition he secretly despised but publicly pretended to revere. He sat at the head of the table, a king on his throne, having successfully called this emergency meeting of the commission. He had presented his fabricated evidence, his voice a smooth, convincing blend of outrage and sorrow, painting Don Antonio Gallo as a treacherous snake who had violated their sacred truce. The other dons, old men with faces like cracked granite, listened in stony silence, their expressions unreadable, their loyalty a prize to be won. Moretti felt the familiar surge of triumph, the intoxicating thrill of absolute control. He was moments away from a unanimous verdict, moments from having the authority to erase Gallo from the board entirely. The heavy oak doors of the room swung open, and all heads turned. It was Gallo, his face calm and resolute, but it was the woman who entered beside him that caused a collective, silent gasp to ripple through the room. It was the server from the hotel, now dressed not in a uniform but in a simple, dark, and impeccably tailored suit, her presence radiating an aura of quiet, intellectual authority that was utterly alien to this environment. Moretti's carefully constructed performance came to a screeching halt. The sight of her here in his sanctuary, standing beside Gallo not as a servant but as an equal, was a sacrilege, an impossibility that his mind struggled to process. A flicker of confusion, quickly followed by a hot surge of rage, crossed his face. He had ordered her destroyed, blacklisted, erased. Yet here she was, a ghost from his moment of humiliation, returned to haunt him at his moment of ultimate triumph. He slammed his fist on the table, the sound cracking through the tense silence like a whip. What is the meaning of this, Antonio? Have you lost your mind? Bringing this nobody into a meeting of the commission? His voice was a low snarl, the corporate polish stripped away to reveal the raw, brutish thug beneath. But Gallo did not respond. He simply took his seat at the opposite end of the table and nodded once, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture toward Alara. The floor, he seemed to say, is yours. The other dons watched, their ancient eyes shifting from the sputtering Moretti to the calm, composed woman who now stood at the center of the room, the focal point of all their collective, dangerous power. She held a small tablet in her hand, its screen dark, her posture one of serene, unshakable confidence. For the first time, Riccardo Moretti felt a cold, unfamiliar tendril of fear snake its way up his spine. Ilara did not immediately speak. She allowed the silence to stretch, to become a weapon in itself, letting the weight of the Don's curiosity and Moretti's rising panic fill the room. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was not loud, not angry, not emotional. It was the calm, measured, and devastatingly clear tone of a university lecturer presenting an irrefutable thesis. She did not look at Gallo or the other dons. Her eyes, cold and brilliant, were locked directly on Riccardo Moretti. For the past 2 weeks, she began, her voice resonating with a quiet power that commanded attention. I have been conducting a thorough analysis of Apex Consolidated's financial architecture. She used his own sterile, corporate language, turning his sword back on him. She tapped the screen of the tablet, and a large display on the wall, previously hidden behind a wood panel, flickered to life. It was filled with a complex web of spreadsheets, flowcharts, and account numbers. For the next 10 minutes, she walked the commission through a masterclass in corporate fraud. She detailed the shell corporations, the illegal asset stripping, the systematic laundering of their collective illicit funds through his legitimate businesses, siphoning off millions for himself. She spoke of specific dates, of hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands, of ghost employees on shared payrolls. She was not making accusations, she was stating facts, each one a hammer blow against the foundation of his empire. The Dons, men who understood the simple brutality of cash, watched in stunned silence, their faces slowly hardening as they began to understand the depth of Moretti's betrayal against them. Moretti's face had drained of all color, leaving a pasty grayish pallor. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his expensive silk tie suddenly feeling like a noose. "Lies!" he stammered, his voice losing its baritone command, rising into a reedy, desperate pitch. "These are fabricated documents! This is a trick, a desperate move by a desperate old man." He pointed a trembling finger at Gallo, trying to deflect, to regain control of the narrative. But no one was looking at Gallo. All eyes were on Ilera, who hadn't even flinched at his outburst. She simply swiped the screen on her tablet, and a new set of documents appeared on the wall. "These documents," she continued, her voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, more piercing, detail a smaller, less significant acquisition from 10 years ago. It was a company called Vance Manufacturing. A new image filled the screen, a grainy photo of a modest brick building, her father's factory. She paused, letting the name hang in the air. It was a small, family-run business. Profitable, debt-free, a pillar of its community. Apex Consolidated acquired it through a series of predatory financial maneuvers, stripped it of its assets, bankrupted its pension fund, and left its owner, a good man who had built his life's work with his own 2 hands, with nothing. The shock of that loss, the sheer injustice of it, caused him to suffer a catastrophic stroke. She finally turned her gaze away from Moretti and looked at the other Dons. "My father," she said, her voice now thick with a cold, righteous fury that was more terrifying than any shout, "has not spoken my name in 3 years." The room was as silent as a tomb. The story, so personal and so brutal, had shifted the ground beneath them. This was no longer just about numbers on a screen. It was about a violation of something even they, in their violent world, held sacred: family, legacy, the honor of a man's name. Alara turned her eyes back to Moretti, whose entire body was now trembling, his mask of superiority completely shattered, revealing the terrified, cornered rat beneath. "You don't remember him, do you, Ricardo? You don't remember my father. You don't remember me. To you, we were never people. We were a line item on a balance sheet, a rounding error in your glorious ascent. You crushed us and dozens of families like us without a second thought, because you believe you are a god and we are merely insects." Her words were not just an accusation, they were a verdict, a final judgment on the nature of his soul. The other Dons looked at Moretti with a new kind of contempt, a disgust reserved for a man who preyed not on his rivals, but on the helpless, a man who broke the unspoken rules of even their savage game. His financial betrayal was a crime against their business, but this was a crime against the very idea of honor itself. "And that," Alara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound that was somehow louder than any roar, "brings us to the real reason we are all here today. It brings us to the matter of the treaty." She swiped the tablet one last time. The screen on the wall went dark for a moment, and then it was filled with the transcript of a series of encrypted text messages. At the top of the screen, in bold letters, was the title of the file: Project Checkmate. A low murmur of shock and disbelief went through the room. Alara began to read the messages aloud, her voice a monotone, clinical indictment. The treaty was a trap. The signing was to be a signal. A wetwork team was on standby, less than a mile from the hotel, ready to move in and eliminate Don Gallo and his entire inner circle. She didn't just read the messages. She played the audio files, the recordings of Moretti's own voice, calm and confident, giving the final orders. The evidence was absolute, irrefutable, and utterly damning. The Dons stared at the screen, then at Moretti, their faces now masks of cold, murderous rage. He had not just planned to kill a rival. He had planned to slaughter a member of the Commission, a man he had just sworn a truce with, an act of treachery so profound it was unthinkable. Ricardo Moretti's downfall was complete. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, but only a choked, pathetic gurgle came out. He was no longer a king. He was a dead man, sitting at the head of a table of his own executioners. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Alara Vance finally exposed the truth. The aftermath was both swift and silent. Riccardo Moretti was never seen again. There was no trial, no public execution. He simply vanished from the world, his existence erased as completely as he had once erased her father's company. A few weeks later, the Securities and Exchange Commission, acting on a highly detailed anonymous tip, launched a massive investigation into Apex Consolidated. The corporate empire, built on a foundation of lies and theft, crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. Its assets seized, its name becoming a byword for corporate malfeasance. The headline spoke of a brilliant, ruthless CEO who had finally overplayed his hand, never knowing that his entire world had been dismantled by a woman whose name he never even bothered to learn. The world saw a financial collapse. Only a handful of men in a smoke-filled room in Little Italy knew it was an execution, carried out not with a bullet, but with the truth. Justice, Alara learned, came in many forms, and sometimes the most satisfying form was the quiet, methodical erasure of a monster from the pages of history, leaving behind only the lesson of his fatal, arrogant pride. Alara Vance did not return to the world of academia, nor did she go back to serving drinks in the gilded cages of the wealthy. She accepted Don Gallo's offer, becoming his most trusted advisor, his consigliere. She did not carry a weapon or engage in the violence of his world, but her mind became the single most feared asset in his organization. She used her unique understanding of human behavior and her newfound expertise in forensic accounting to navigate the treacherous waters of their world, protecting Gallo's interests, exposing his enemies, and bringing a strange, intellectual order to his chaotic empire. The money she earned was more than she had ever dreamed of, but its true value was not in its purchasing power, but in its ability to heal. She moved her father into a private, state-of-the-art neurological care facility, a serene place with sunlit gardens and the best doctors in the country. His condition was permanent, the damage done by Moretti's cruelty irreversible, but in his new, peaceful environment, some of the light returned to his eyes. There were moments, fleeting and precious, when he would look at her, and a flicker of recognition, of the deep, abiding love of a father for his daughter, would cross his face. In those moments, Alara knew she had won. She had not only brought a titan to his knees, but she had reclaimed the one thing he had truly stolen from them, their dignity. She had honored her father's legacy not by rebuilding what was lost, but by becoming something new, something powerful, a silent guardian forged in the fires of injustice, forever proving that the most underestimated person in the room is always the most dangerous. If Alara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.